There were, I think, 3 6 magnitude earthquakes in the last couple of days, and there are several 5 and 4 magnitude earthquakes. So I chose this particular poem because of those recent events. These are 3 stories from my childhood. This is called Disasters. In the Philippines, we jump over puddles after a typhoon. We gather clay from volcanic ash, making shapes that make sense. After the earth rumbles, we run into the wreckage, make do with the broken, and assemble something whole. 1992. Before I learned how to memorize names of my classmates, I've memorized names of typhoons. Asyang, Biring, Kunsing, Ditang. And before I fully understood the mechanics of how storms would come and go, I understood that we have brownouts so we could have fun. The adults made sure that the joy is contained inside the house while the storm is raging outside. We would play with shadows and lights and dogs and rabbits and eagles and spaceships. My cousins and I would race to see who could light the most candles, and when the light comes back on, each of us would get a candle and sing, "Happy birthday to you," even if it's nobody's birthday, just so we could make a wish before we could blow the candles out. We wished for less damaged homes, we wished for less floods, we wished for less deaths. And when the sun comes back on, we would run outside and play. We would jump over puddles after a typhoon, as if to say, "Look, we've won. Wishes do come true." 1991. I was barely 6 when Mount Pinatubo produced the second largest terrestrial eruption of the 20th century. It was the only recorded event that was able to reduce temperature on a global scale. Of course, I didn't understand what was happening back then. All I knew was the roads were gray, the houses were gray, the clouds were gray, the rains were gray, the rainbows were gray. Adults told us to stay indoors, that something in the air is toxic, that we shouldn't come out and play, but children needed to be children. We would gather clay from volcanic ash, making shapes that make sense. Well, we haven't fully understood the difference between squares and rectangles or oblongs and circles. Those afternoons we were making complex prisms and detailed pyramids and perfect spheres. One hot August afternoon, the other adults called us outside. There were sightings of blue moons a few days back, but it was barely dusk, so it shouldn't be that. When we stepped out, we saw the most beautiful sunset that we've ever seen, a burning burst of maroon, lavender, magenta, and all the other colors that I couldn't identify or pronounce back then. The heavens were electrified, screeching with life, and while the dust hasn't settled and the smoke is far from clear, we were all able to see in color again. 1990. When the Great Luzon earthquake hit us, the other kids and we were dancing. Our 2 left feet were zigzagging across the floor. Our arms were flailing about in a graceless abandon. It wasn't until the adults screamed at us to take cover that we realized, earthquakes, they're not supposed to be fun. For almost a month, Baguio was all that is being discussed in the news. That the earthquake has destroyed the roads, rendered the airports inaccessible, that there's no way to send in help, convinced that there are no more survivors. International rescue operations have pulled out barely a week after the disaster. But we were all too stubborn to accept defeat. To us, there were no dead ends, only people who have given up. Our knees haven't even stopped shaking yet, but with trembling hands and steady heart, we picked up the shovels and started digging. Those weeks, there were no miners, no butchers, no carpenters, no fathers or mothers or brothers or sisters. There were only rescuers, and brick by brick, rubble by rubble, we started looking for what was lost. under one pile. They were able to recover 2 girls 11 days after the disaster. And under the same ruin, one man fought hunger and darkness and death for 14 days worldwide. Their stories are still being used as barometers for hope. We, the sun kissed, the wind swept, the weather beaten, our stories are still being used as barometers for hope. I was born in an archipelago that spells disasters. It's 7,100 islands born out of wedlock between 59 volcanoes and 1,200 kilometers of fault lines. But we're also 100 million people strong, 100 million people surviving, 100 million people ready for more in the Philippines. We jump over puddles after a typhoon. We gather clay from volcanic ash, making shapes that make sense. After the earth rumbles, we run into the wreckage, make do with the broken, and assemble something whole.